Cool. So sign in link is on the whiteboard if you missed it. So today we'll be covering anonymity and mixing and altcoins specifically. So we recently talked about scaling, we talked about enterprise blockchain, but today we'll be covering anonymity, which is one of the more, I guess, core components of what blockchain solutions, I guess, as a stretch goal, they want this sort of anonymity. So if we think back to when Bitcoin was created, it was built on top of this movement, the cypherpunk movement, where privacy was a really, really important factor, and anonymity and privacy were like these two main goals that they were trying to achieve with this financial system and this cryptocurrency, right? So today we'll be talking about just a lecture overview. We'll go into a little bit of the basics of anonymity. We'll talk a little bit about what de-anonymization is. We'll tell you how to achieve some sort of anonymity through mixing coins, anonymity through certain altcoins that support anonymity or privacy, and then a last extra slide, or we'll talk about Mimblewimble. So just to get started, anonymity basics. So just a quick survey for all of you. Is anonymity in Bitcoin just only good for buying drugs on the Silk Road? Shoot away. Or does anybody have any suggestions why, other reasons why privacy or anonymity is a good idea just in any sort of financial system? Yeah?
If something is hacked and compromised, you don't have much of my other information like my social security.
Yeah, cool. And well, what were you going to say?
I was going to say as a means of protection for whistleblowers.
Yeah, sure. And also, one last thing is that Bitcoin, because it's on a blockchain, it's very transparent. It's public to everyone. So anyone on the Bitcoin network can see any sort of details about your accounts, your balances, which is kind of scary if you think about it. So I'll propose this scenario. So let's pretend in an imaginary world we use Bitcoin on a day-to-day basis, and we don't use banks anymore. We only use Bitcoin as our sole transaction or money value transfer system. So we call this, I guess, the scenario Bob's Burgers. So pretend that you purchase something at Walgreens. Your cashier takes your public key address and scans it, and he looks you up on blockchain.info. And he sees that you've made 20 purchases in a month to this address that's publicly listed as Bob's Burgers. But everyone knows that this Bob's Burgers public address is the internet's biggest porn site. So once he sees that, oh, you sent payments to this address, he knows a little bit about your dirty little secrets. And also what's really scary is he knows just the list of transactions that you've conducted in the past, which is really scary. So we have another extreme example where you can use it to blackmail. Currently, if you look up people's public key addresses on blockchain.info, you can see how much money is in that account or tied to that address. So if the same employee sees that you're sitting on this stash of $60 million in Bitcoin, he'll be like, I don't have to work this dead-end job anymore. I can just kidnap your relative or something and blackmail you and know exactly how much to blackmail you for. So that's pretty scary, right? So the aspect we're trying to emphasize is blockchains aren't anonymous by default. What they do offer is, what they actually try to do is they make a central database and they kind of distribute it amongst everyone else. So everyone has the same access control to this set of public data. If, let's say, you have a Google Drive account, all their files that you store on your Google Drive, you want it to stay somewhat anonymous or somewhat private, and also share only certain information with only people that you trust. If you had this sort of Google Drive system on a blockchain, everyone can see what kind of data you read and write to the blockchain, And you get this transparency aspect, you get this auditability, but you can't control who gets access to your data because everyone gets access to this data. So all this data is public by default, and you can argue that private blockchains are slightly a little more anonymous because of the fact that only members in this private blockchain can access the data. But in a sense, it still succumbs to the same downfalls where everyone in this private blockchain can see everything that's going on, rather than like limited access control. So what most blockchains are, they're pseudonymous at best. They use some sort of identity that's not our real-world identity, and they or in Bitcoin specifically, we use like a Bitcoin address. If you think about, let's say, if you use Twitter, you use Reddit, you have a Twitter handle, you have a Reddit account. These are like pseudonyms. So these might be tied to some sort of real-world identity, but they don't have to be. So pseudonyms for these accounts online can be linked, but not necessarily. So like you can create like multiple throwaway accounts on Reddit that might not be easily trackable. So that's the main idea. So we get to this idea of linking, which is how do we associate our real-world identity to some sort of pseudonym? We also call this de-anonymization. And so in Bitcoin, our identity in Bitcoin is our public key address. In Ethereum, we have a public key address and also some sort of account tied to it. So when we're dealing in these like blockchain systems, these pseudonymous systems, our pseudonyms are just these like accounts. And in order to achieve some sort of like small degree of anonymity, the best thing that you can do is just never use your pseudonyms again. So like if you were to just create a new Reddit account every single time so someone can't track your post history or your browsing history, something like that. So it's recommended that you do that, but this takes a lot of effort. Generating a new address every single time you receive Bitcoin. But if you think about it, if someone were able to track where you're sending your Bitcoin, they can easily determine which accounts belong to you. It doesn't get rid of the fact that someone can do some sort of deduction and figure out which accounts and how much you have in your accounts. It's mainly just to escape like preliminary, like, oh, this account is a new account or something like that. And Ethereum, it's not as feasible because it's account-based and not UTXO-based. So when we're talking about anonymity, it's not like a clear black and white kind of scale. We have more of like a grayscale kind of anonymity, level of anonymity, where you can think about anonymity as in how much effort you put into like masking your identity, how difficult it is to associate your pseudonym with your real-world identity. So if you really, really wanted to, you can do a bunch of really complicated maneuvers to make sure that you're not as easily trackable, and this takes a lot of effort, but your level of anonymity or degree of anonymity is really high. And this is usually pretty doable because in Bitcoin, we can create public key and private key like keys pretty easily. You can use if we remember back to the first lecture where we talked about the scale of how many addresses that you can create in Bitcoin. It ties a little bit back into that because every person can have a lot of accounts associated with them without compromising any sort of like security of Bitcoin. So why is this kind of important, right? So we go back to the example of, is anonymity only like useful for buying drugs on the black market? Not really, right? So we have another example where, let's say you're paying back a friend. So in this example, you and your friend eat at a restaurant, but the restaurant refuses to split the bill, so you pay the full amount first. And so your friend sends you some Bitcoin later, and when you do go back to a store to make a purchase, your friend's Bitcoin isn't accepted because the merchant from their eyes, they think that it's associated with drug dealers, and they don't want to accept it. And this is problematic because this breaks one of our fundamental properties that we want in currency, which is fungibility. So I think I talked about fungibility a little bit back when I was talking about CryptoKitties, but that's the reason why CryptoKitties isn't really fungible is the fact that these are like collector items, and each item is unique. But the idea of fungibility is that you want each dollar that you have to be equal to any other arbitrary $1 bill. But if a merchant isn't willing to accept some sort of payment because it's associated with some sort of negative connotation, then you lose that fungibility aspect. It's kind of like, if you think about it, if you're given a shiny quarter and a really like dirty quarter, which one would you rather take? Essentially, they're the same value, but you're slightly psychologically inclined to take the shiny one, right? And so that's another problem that we have in if our transaction systems aren't completely anonymous. And lastly, let's say you're running a business on a blockchain called BitBlock-based CoinPay.cash. And so you want to stay you want to keep tabs on your competitor, CoinBitBlock.pay. And so what you do is you purchase their product. But because of how the Bitcoin network works, if you conduct business with one address, you see their history of transactions, you see how much money they have in their system, and that's really problematic, right? So you can see how much operational expenses that they're using, how much revenue they have, who their customers are, but they can also do the reverse because they have your public key address too. And so that's a property that we also want to maintain if we're having an anonymous financial system. So the conclusion is that lack of anonymity means everyone you've transacted with gets to see how much money you've spent in the past and well on into the future if they decide to keep tabs on you down the line. This is kind of like if you pay for something at a store using your credit card, that store can see your past credit card history and your future credit card history, and even see how much money that you have associated with your bank account. That's a little bit too invasive into your privacy, so that's why Bitcoin isn't the anonymous, like the dream anonymous system that people have been thinking about. So a little bit about the ethics of anonymity. Besides using cryptocurrencies or developing anonymous cryptocurrency just for money laundering or black market illicit activities, we want to create these anonymous financial systems because they're useful in some degree, in not just these like black market practices, keeping tabs on your like anti-money laundering laws and KYC laws from last lecture. Knowing a little bit about your like customers can prevent a little bit too much into like the black market practices, but you do compromise the security or like the anonymity of your system. And it's also hard to implement like morality at a technological level. It's really hard to determine, or code can't really determine if your execution is moral or immoral, right? If you think about an example where we use oracles, where oracles are expected to report the latest data or the most correct data, if you were to program it in such a way that it doesn't give the right values, then it's pretty difficult. And so we have to also think about, do the positive benefits of these anonymous cryptocurrencies outweigh the cost? So an example is the browsing protocol Tor. It was created by the US government for officials to monitor web traffic, but it's useful in other ways, such as enables free speech for reporters that are in oppressive regimes, and allows a lot of other, besides the black market activity, it allows for people just to maintain their privacy more than, or like they maintain a degree of privacy that they are comfortable with. Any questions? Okay, let's talk a little bit about what de-anonymization is. So de-anonymization, if we recall back to a few slides before, it's also the idea of linking identities together. So the goal of de-anonymization is to link someone's real-world identity, so like my driver's license, my social security number, like passport, something like that, with their pseudonym. So if I had like a Reddit account, to tie these two together, something like that would be linking or de-anonymization. So there's two main ways that we can actually do this, through transaction graph analysis. So by looking at blockchain history and using like deduction to figure something out, and then we also have clustering. So attributing multiple identities to the same identity. So first, let's talk about what clustering is. Clustering is basically the idea that you're taking multiple identities and trying to compress it into one identity. So let's say if I have like 5 different Bitcoin accounts that I'm using, if someone's able to cluster all 5 of these to me, then they've successfully clustered and linked these accounts to my like personal identity. And so there's 2 ways that you can do this. Mainly in like reverse faction. So you have the merging of transaction outputs. So what this means is, for example, if I'm buying a coffee for 0.05 Bitcoin, and I have 2 accounts that don't have individually 0.05 Bitcoin, but I have 0.02 in one account, 0.03 in another account, and so I use these 2 accounts and I bundle them together so that I can purchase this coffee of 0.05. And so most of the time, combining these types of outputs or these inputs together, most of the time you're dealing with the same person, because it's very rare, or you can make a fair assumption that when these types of transactions are happening, that they're usually the same person. It's very rare unless it's like some sort of multi-sig transaction where multiple inputs come together. If multiple inputs come together, you can be fairly confident that you're dealing with the same person, and so that's one way that you can merge or cluster 2 accounts into one particular identity. The second way is using change addresses. So let's say we were following our scheme that we talked about, that every single transaction that we do, we create a new account and we move our money through those new accounts. So let's say I have 1 whole Bitcoin and I want to buy this coffee for 0.05. And so I have the change that I get from this transaction is 0.95. But instead of transferring it back to the original account that I had the 1 Bitcoin in, or the address that I had it in, I send it to a secondary account that I have on the side that I just created to handle this like change address. And so usually in this scenario, if someone sees that you have a different change address associated with a transaction, you can be pretty confident too that this is the same person, because there's no one in their right mind that wants to give away 0.95 of their Bitcoin just arbitrarily after a really small transaction, right? And so these 2 main heuristics for clustering are very useful, but in both cases you can associate these A and A prime accounts back to the same person or the same entity. You might not know who this person is, but you can be fairly confident that they're the same person. Second of all, you can do it by like the graph analysis. So by looking at like the history of the blockchain history and looking at like volume and just sheer amount of transactions that have been going through. So 2 ways that you can do this type of identifying services is by tagging the transactions. So if I wanted to figure out a little bit more about, let's say, Coinbase, a little bit more about how they function, first I just make a few transactions into Coinbase and out of Coinbase, so I get a little bit of info on certain accounts they have within their control. And so using that like data, I can figure out, yeah, these few accounts belong to Coinbase, and I can start tracking a little bit about their business processes or their account activity. And so you wait for all these multiple accounts that you've like figured out belong to Coinbase. You wait for them to be like merged into some sort of cluster that you can analyze further. Second of all is you look at like activity of search and addresses. So back in 2013, Mt. Gox was the largest like entity in the blockchain space or Bitcoin space. So they had a lot of volume going in and out, and quite a few transactions going in and out of their like accounts associated with Mt. Gox. So that's, if you look carefully at the purple dot right here, you can see that the volume represented by the size of the circle, that's pretty huge. And the lines coming out of it, there's quite a few. But then if you look at a little bit, you look further down to Satoshi Dice. Satoshi Dice was a gambling site that allowed for deposits and withdrawals of smaller denominations. So that you can see clearly that they have a lot of transactions. That's why it's really gray on the outside. But the volume of transactions are very small. So that's just what you can do to figure out a little bit about like the activity through if you know like certain aspects of these services online. Does that make any sense? Any questions? Oh yeah.
Yeah, with the previous slide, with the tracking.
Mm-hmm.
So in the bottom example, like, is there a difference between the change transaction and the like non-change transaction? Like, you see that as a third person?
So when you're looking through like transactions on the Bitcoin network, if you look carefully at like, if you remember back to like the UTXO model, so if you break open a piggy bank, the leftover like coins in the piggy bank, they have to be rerouted somewhere else. They have to be rerouted back into a new piggy bank that you create, or sent to someone else, right? So by looking at that attribute where you're rerouting that change of the coins, you can figure out that probably or probabilistically that the remaining amount that's sent to like this new address, you can be fairly confident that those two parties or those two accounts belong to the same person. Yeah.
Because you know the coffee shop one.
You know the coffee shop one, and then the other one that you just see two different addresses, and then you can't be actually you can if you already know the coffee shop's address, and then you see that someone's inputting a transaction into this or sending this coffee shop some money, and then a new account is getting the remaining amount. The remaining amount that's sent to a new address, even though they're two separate like pseudonyms, as in two different addresses, you can be. It doesn't make sense that this person's willing to just to give away their remaining 0.95 Bitcoin. So you can, using like some sort of like deduction, you can figure out that this is probably the same person, and this is just the new account that he created just for storing this remaining amount of Bitcoin.
And let's say if you didn't know either address, like if you know if the person spent 0.95 Bitcoin and there's 0.05 exchange.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to get at. So if you didn't know the coffee shop's address, then you have like a 50-50 probability of like figuring out that maybe the coffee shop address is the one that received the 0.05, or the coffee shop address is the one that received the 0.095. Yeah. Okay. Any further questions? So we've talked about identifying services online like Mt. Gox or like Satoshi Dice, which is a gambling site. So how do we identify individuals? So there are several simple techniques that you can use to associate addresses with individuals. You can do it, the most naive way is just to either ask them for their address, like verbally or online, and saying, hey, I want to send you some Bitcoin. And so once they give you their address to send the Bitcoin to, you can see their history of transactions, you can see their balance, and a lot of information about them that they may not want. Carelessness is if you were to like randomly post online saying, hi, I'm this person and I'm looking for some Bitcoin donations, some ETH donations. If you can send some over, that'd be great. That tells the community that this address is associated with this account that's posting, and now you have some sort of link. And then lastly, you have some service providers that probably do a little bit more complex data analysis into looking at who's in control of certain Bitcoin addresses. So a company called Scribe, I don't know if they're still around, but back for as long as we've taught this, their main goal is to expose funds derived from illicit activities and detect complex money laundering activities. So they do some sort of like identification and lookup for, I guess, coins. And I'll talk a little bit about how they actually do some sort of like detection of illicit activities or money laundering. So we have this idea of taint analysis. So taint on its own doesn't really have a negative connotation. Taint is just the percentage of funds that can be traced back to this other person. So let's say if there's Alice and Bob. Alice and Bob have been sending money back and forth, and so Bob just wants to know, hi, this Bitcoin that she's just sent over, how much, or he can just look into his account and see, hey, how much of my Bitcoin actually can be traced back to Alice? So that's an aspect of taint. Taint analysis can reveal information that's useful for detecting like bad activity. So you can see if money came from a tainted address or a tainted source. So if you tag some sort of black market address site as like an off limits or like a not safe for work kind of source, and then you can just use taint analysis to figure out how much of my coins can be traced back to this bad address, and that reveals interesting information, and that's actually what happened to Ross Ulbricht. So the way that he actually, he didn't really like try to obfuscate his like dirty coins that he got off of Silk Road. So he had his like Silk Road account, and he had his like private own account that he possessed that he didn't share with anyone. So he claimed that in his own private stash, all of these coins were like, they came from innocent sources, they came from legitimate sources, but using taint analysis, it was revealed that all this money came from his Silk Road address, which basically foiled his claim. And that's a little bit about taint analysis. To the side, if we look at like the naive way to ship coins around, you can create multiple addresses and send your Bitcoin to those new addresses, but it never gets rid of taint. It never gets rid of like the idea that like this Bitcoin came from an illegitimate source. So because you're not introducing any sort of new like untainted coins back into the mix, they stay like at a 100% taint, which means that if you just linearly look back in history, you can see that it came from this bad source. If you were to try to clean or manually mix your coins and introduce clean coins with your dirty coins, if you continually mix clean coins, you can see how we get from 100% taint to 66% taint to 33 to 11% taint. And if you were careless, you can always get back to really tainted again. Does that make any sense? So that's a little bit into what taint analysis is. It's useful for determining if your coins came from sort of some particular address. And so this is like a taint analysis tool from blockchain.info. I think this is for specifically like a DICE website. This is just tracking how much of this Bitcoin came from this DICE website. And you can see that this, like your Bitcoin that you own has like 5% taint, meaning that 5% of this like total Bitcoin that you have can be traced back to this gambling site. Any questions? You guys ready for a break? Okay. So we'll have a 3-minute break or something like that, and then Gillian will take over for the next two sections. Or actually, a quick announcement. So next week we don't have lecture because next week's is Cal Day. Cal Day, we don't have access to the room, so we're not having a lecture then. But our final lecture will be the week after on April 28th. So yeah. We have one more lecture left. This is the second to last lecture, and the last lecture is the 28th. So next week, there's no class, because it's wild. Campus is wild on Cal Day. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I didn't see that.
Good job. Yeah.
Good job. What did I do? Try me. Fuck. We're gonna end early today.
There's like a map, there's like kind of choose not to accept it. Yeah. If you know that
Okay, let's get started again. The sooner we finish the material, the sooner we can go outside and enjoy a beautiful day. So we're going to talk about anonymity through mixing. So Brian introduced the idea of why we want anonymity, and furthermore he introduced the idea of wanting to avoid this sort of taint analysis, wanting to get out of having my Bitcoin be able to be tracked back to sort of perhaps sketchy sources, even though I maybe didn't have anything to do with those origins. And so one way we can do that is through mixing. And if we go back to the idea of like a traditional solution, does anybody, like, I don't know why you would be, but does anybody know how money laundering works? Any briefs? Yeah, go for it. Why do you know?
It's just a general process of obfuscating the origin of a money financial.
Yeah, okay, so the general premise is you want to somehow obfuscate where your money came from. So there are various ways to do that, one of which is to create lots of fake shell companies and then run your money through a shell company. And so the same sort of idea could hold. So in the traditional idea, we can have shell companies that write off deposits as purchases. You transfer money through this shell company because you don't want to associate it with your actual company, stuff like that. Anybody not familiar with the idea of a shell company? Don't want to spend time on something people already know. Okay, Cool. So the main idea here is that blockchain, we can take that idea of a shell company and abstract that onto the blockchain as well. So if we remember that it doesn't cost any money to generate lots of new public addresses. So one thing we could do is perhaps take our original funds and pass them through something else. And so we associate more public addresses with it. It becomes more difficult to track where it originally came from. We'll just change names a couple times. And that's one thing that we can do. Another thing we can do is something called mixing. And so this idea of an anonymity set is that set of new public addresses that we've created. And if we pass our money through a large set of addresses, well, it comes out on the other end. And the money is perhaps broken up, but the main point here is that it's no longer associated with our original public address. So remember, not only drug lords want to be anonymous, it's beneficial for everybody. If we go to the credit card, or we go to Walgreens and they can't look up our entire history, transaction history. So we want to be anonymous, especially because of the transparency. And so multiple rounds of mixing increases our anonymity set. So we want our anonymity set to be large, specifically so that since one round of mixing gives me n peers that the money could have ended up with, well then the more rounds of mixing I go through, the potential anonymity increases exponentially. Does that sort of make sense to everybody? The larger the anonymity set, the better. And that is precisely because it becomes more difficult to relink whatever address the money came out of with whatever address you put in, whatever the address the money came from. And so some additional desirable properties, since we're talking in ideals. Well, ideally, we'd also like trustlessness and plausible deniability. So trustlessness is just the idea that we don't want to have to trust a third person when we're going through this process of mixing. We don't want, just because I want anonymity doesn't mean I should have to trust a third party for that to get that anonymity. Furthermore, it would be ideal if I could make whatever I'm doing look plausibly deniable. So for example, with the Silk Road case, I want to make sure that going through extra rounds of anonymity doesn't make me liable or doesn't make me sketchy. And so I would postulate, in fact, that you can't have all of these desirable ideal properties, and we'll look into why that is. So to go over some types of mixing, centralized mixers, Altcoin Exchange mixing, decentralized mixing protocols, and privacy-focused altcoins. So we'll talk a little bit about each of those things, but the name should be pretty informative. So we'll begin with the idea of a centralized mixer. So centralized mixer is a trusted third party, TPP, and it will send you, so Alice puts in her money here, and her money is a little bit sketchy, and the centralized mixing service has a whole bunch of people who put in their coins, and what they do is they just mix the coins around, and they'll give you the same output on the other end, minus a small cleaning fee, and hopefully after having mixed and having taken different transactions apart and reintroduce them together to give you the right amount at the end, hopefully the taint of the coins that you initially put in got sort of washed away. Does this concept make sense to everybody? It's like sticking it into the laundry machine and expecting something out on the other end, but you have to trust a third-party washing machine. Okay, yes, go for it.
So how do these guys guarantee that the coin that we received is not breaking up? So for example, this one Bitcoin is tainted, and Mixer is getting it, and then it sends 0.9. How is it guaranteed that it's not the same one Bitcoin UTXO was broken up into two pieces?
Right, yeah. So the question was, how do we guarantee that we don't just get the same Bitcoin on the other end and they've just promised a service? Well, really one way you could check is if the company provided some sort of taint analysis. So as you put in your money, and really that's the whole point of going through this, right? You put in your money and you want to make sure, perhaps I have high taint or some percentage of taint, and on the other end I just want to make sure that I either have lower taint, which would give me evidence that I have been mixed a little bit, or really that something has changed. Because if the taint analysis has changed, then we have some evidence that it's gone through some breaking up and reintroducing. Go for it.
So it's basically like shopping cards.
Exactly. Yeah.
Where would this centralized mixing service get the best of
Right. So the problem with the centralized mixer is it requires some amount of capital, right? The centralized mixer needs to have some untainted capital so that they can mix and help you sort of equalize out your taint mixture. So that's one of the challenges of having a centralized mixer. Another option is to have just lots and lots of people participate in it. And one idea that's been thrown out there is, well, if I have very clean Bitcoin, I don't really have an incentive to go to a mixer. And if everybody who goes to a mixer has dirty Bitcoin, well, now you're just washing dirty clothes with dirty clothes, right? So one idea that has been proposed is this idea of incentivizing people with clean Bitcoin to come to this sort of service and provide their Bitcoin as like sort of an equalizer. But there are various ways to get around this. This is just the basic protocol. Cool, yeah.
What if the primary customer of a mixing service probably be someone that's like sketchy? So with that in mind, like, why would the community want there to be mixing services if the primary customers are going to be sketchy?
Right, so that goes back to sort of the idea of why is anonymity desirable? And it's not just sketchy sources that like want to go through this. It's just about anybody who wants to abstract away their previous transaction history. And so maybe you have a reason, you have something to hide, but maybe you also just like don't want people to know what you've been buying. And going through an extra round of mixing abstracts away your transaction history from what happens the next time you spend something. Does that make a little bit more sense?
Yeah, it does. And then also, just curious, you know how many like transactions happen in the mixer to wash it clean?
Yeah, so that's very much up to the centralized mixer service you choose. And one thing that you have to trust the centralized mixer with, and we'll get into this with the pros and cons slide, but you sort of have to trust that they're not logging all of the transactions that they make inside the mixer. Does that make sense? Because if you have a mixer, a centralized mixer, that as they're breaking apart transactions, they're also recording where, like, we broke apart this like sketchy mix and we sent some of that sketchy mixture to somebody else, but now we have a record of, well, this person gave us this tainted coin and we gave him something else, but if some government entity came to ask for it, we could give them like very traceable record of where all the coins went. That's like not so good. And so that's one of the cons of trusting a centralized mixer. I'm not sure, did I answer your question?
Well, my question was, how many times does it
get
mixed?
Um,
You said it depends on the mixer, but is there like, just out of curiosity, like a number, like a range?
I'm not sure that I have a number specifically for you. It really depends on, like for example, if I have n inputs, you would expect them to at least mix it like n squared and cubed.
Are there any mixers on the market?
Yeah. So we'll go through some examples after. Cool. So some pros and cons on centralized mixers. So counterparty risk. The idea that the mixer, well, remember, it is a centralized entity, and we are in the blockchain space where things are relatively unregulated. And so you kind of have to trust that your mixer isn't going to just run away with your coins, which, yes and no. There might be incentives to do that. Logging risk, so what I was saying previously with the mixer might have an incentive to just log where they've been breaking apart all the transactions and then sending them off to, and that can be problematic for you if that information ever comes to light. And then centralization risk. So it's happened in the past where like if the government comes down and just shuts down the mixer, well, what do you do then? Like you don't really have anybody to go to for your coins. And furthermore, it's a single point of failure. So if a hacker really wanted to figure out like where these coins have been going, etc., they would just have to attack like those services. And if they've been keeping logging records, well, the hacker would then have access to them. So some examples of centralized mixing protocols. Mixcoin relies on this idea of having a trusted third party. Mixcoin came out of Princeton Research, and they've been around, I think, maybe since 2015. Don't quote me on that. And then Blindcoin came out of UMD. The same idea as Mixcoin, but it doesn't require a trusted third party. Or the trusted third party cannot infer the mix of inputs. Does that make any sense? Just some examples, some names to look up if you're perhaps interested in learning further. Okay, so then we'll go on to talk about altcoin exchange mixing. And so perhaps this is most intuitive. So the main idea is that we send dirty funds through several layers of altcoins. And because we can switch our money from Bitcoin to Ethereum to name whichever other favorite altcoins you have, well then those exchanges and then changing them back can obfuscate the money trail that you previously had associated with a certain amount of Bitcoin. And so, for example, here, if Alice puts in her dirty input and then she exchanges and then does a whole bunch of series of exchanges and eventually comes back with Bitcoin, well, the Bitcoin from the exchange is not the Bitcoin that she put in. And so in this way, she's found a way to get a different set of Bitcoin for approximately the same amount. Does this make sense to everybody? Should just be like currency exchange. Okay. Yeah, question?
I think you already answered this, but I think you said, so exchanges between alts are not as regulated between as alts with fiat.
Yeah, so with Coinbase and Bitfinex, for instance, usually they'll ask for the most KYC AML. So that's what we talked about last lecture, right? And usually they'll ask for the most regulation, most identifying information, specifically when you're trying to take your money out. And so often they won't limit how much you can trade inside, but if you try to take your money out of the exchange, that's when they start asking for more identification. And so the pro is that the adversary, whoever's trying to track you, would have to track that transaction chain through several different blockchains, and that just makes it infinitely more difficult. And furthermore, you have better plausible deniability because it looks like just basic currency exchange. People do that all the time. It's like speculation, right? You make some money. But then the cons on this are counterparty risk. So if the exchange gets hacked, again, all of that information of your coins came in from here and your coins went out there, all of that, first of all, you could lose your money if the exchange gets hacked and you're going through a third party. Second of all, those exchanges often hold some amount of information about you. So remember that we talked about KYC and AML, and that's what we said earlier. Knowing your customer requires that you have some sort of identification, and generally when we have that identification, well then the FBI has something to track you to some particular transaction you made. Okay, any questions about this? Solid. Okay, so moving on. Decentralized mixing protocols. So hopefully you guys saw this one coming. We are in the blockchain space, which means that we're a fan of decentralization. And so we've been talking a lot about these centralized solutions, and now we're moving towards a decentralized one. So the idea is essentially to remove that counterparty risk by getting rid of that trusted third party, and then you can avoid fees and you avoid a central point of failure by taking out this middleman. So this proposition is to create a network of peers outside of the Bitcoin network, and they'll cooperate to make transactions. And so if we can put out some protocol that, first of all, doesn't require anybody to trust each other, which sounds familiar, and second of all, allows people to cooperate to mix their coins, well then we have exactly what we're looking for. We have a decentralized mixing protocol. Does that idea make sense to everybody? Motivation should be pretty clear too. Okay. So, going on with this, so this first protocol is called CoinJoin. It's been around since 2011, which is for a long time. And the idea is to mix together coins in a single N of N multi-signature transaction. So, do people remember what a multi-sig transaction is? Yes? No? Solid. Okay. So this just requires that I have to have all N people who put in their coins all agree to mix up the coins, and then we're all going to get our money back. And so the pro is that the funds can't be stolen because there is no third party to steal them. The con, however, is that it's not necessarily secure against somebody who's just in like my set of N. It's what we call a passive adversary. So if there's somebody in our set of N who's just there to record which public keys were in our set of N and which public keys got what amount on the other end. There's not really a protection against public keys that just sit in that mixture of N and collect information. And so that's what we mean when we say it's vulnerable to traffic it's Furthermore, it's not plausibly deniable. it's very unlikely that you ever need in a real-life situation to do an N-of-N multi-sig transaction. And so when those show up on the blockchain, they're very noticeable and they're easy to track. So that's perhaps one reason why it's not plausibly deniable. And third of all, it's not DOS attack resistant. So you only need one malicious node who, in the middle of the protocol, so let's say like we had N people agree, and then halfway through one node decides, no, I'm out. Well then nobody gets, like the whole protocol just fails and nobody gets their money mixed. Does that make sense? Yay. Okay. So we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but Dash, who here has heard of Dash? Cryptocurrency? Okay. Dash uses CoinJoin. CoinJoin is old and well understood. It's production tested, and there are a lot of implementations, which include like Join Market, Shufflepuff, Dark Wallet, SharedCoin, CoinShuffle, CoinShuffle++, and there are various implementations of CoinJoin. So it's just an idea, and there are various ways you can implement it using extra layers of cryptography. So you think elliptic curve cryptography, think Chaumian signatures of David Chaum's blind signatures. So again, this is just a protocol, and we build on top of this. Okay. So pros and cons of decentralized mixing protocols. Pros, anonymity against the mix facilitator because we no longer have a mix facilitator, and furthermore, no central point of failure. The cons, however, we went over. So trade-off between plausible deniability and security, trade-off between having a centralized server and anonymity, and then de-anonymization. Okay, any questions about the pros and cons? Okay, so let's talk about fair exchange mixers. Does anybody know what a fair exchange protocol is? It's not just unique to blockchain, it's just sort of a concept. Okay, so fair exchange protocol, suppose you have two parties. You have Alice and Bob, who wish to trade their cryptographic items somehow, and you run into a problem. Suppose Alice sends her item to Bob, and then Bob refuses to send his item to Alice, and then in that exchange, it's not a fair exchange, right? Bob got Alice's item, and Alice got nothing in return. So a fair exchange protocol aims to make sure that never happens, that they each get each other's item, and if the item being exchanged reaches certain criteria, then we can improve our fair exchange protocol so that it capitalizes on these nice properties, so that we can do things like we no longer require a trusted third party. So if we talk about the fair exchange mixer, the idea is mainly that we build upon that fair exchange protocol, and then because we're trading things like Bitcoin, we can make sure that we no longer need that trusted third party. Do you have a question? Oh, no? Okay, solid. Right, so we no longer need a trusted third party, and furthermore, we can also detect a dishonest third party. And so the main idea is that Alice will deposit her dirty coins, and then this magical mixer will give her a voucher. And Alice doesn't have to be the person who receives that voucher, it could be Bob, but essentially it's a way for her to deposit her dirty coins and then receive unlinked coins. And the main problem with this idea, the fair exchange mixer, is just that it requires having enough transactions. And so if you don't have enough transactions, well, there's not a whole lot the fair exchange mixer can do. You will get your same amount on the other end, but it still might be tainted or something like that. Questions about this? Cool. Okay, so again, pros and cons. The slides will be up, but we basically covered all of those. Okay, so if nobody has any questions about the section we just talked about, then we're going to go into privacy-focused altcoins, so actual applications of everything we just talked about. So we did talk about CoinJoin. CoinJoin, one application of CoinJoin is in Dash, and so Dash is a privacy-centric cryptocurrency, and that's initially why it did so well, because it was sort of the first privacy-centric cryptocurrency that most people heard about, and it just kind of like took off because everyone was like, aha, like we understand sort of the basic problems with privacy in the Bitcoin network, and this cryptocurrency claims to address a lot of them, and it does like a pretty good job because CoinJoin is a protocol that we all sort of understand and know. And so the main idea behind it is it employs a network of master nodes, and it'll do things like vote on proposals, instantly confirm transactions, and then most importantly, mix the coins by default of all of the network participants. And it uses this CoinJoin protocol that everyone sort of knew, and And that's sort of like the main idea behind Dash. So if you had any questions about the cryptocurrency before, hopefully you have a better understanding of why people believe in it now. But this is the sort of analysis you should go through whenever you see specifically like a cryptocurrency that claims to be privacy-centric. Any questions about this? Yeah, go for it.
So it says almost everyone is participating.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Almost everyone is participating in this mixing. How can one avoid actually being mixed if like all transactions supposedly go through the mixer?
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
So in the pros section,
Yeah.
second bullet point says almost everyone is participating in CoinJoin transactions. So I assume that almost everyone is part of transactions being mixed, right?
Yeah.
How and why would anyone would avoid that mixer if that's kind of like the idea behind this coin?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Well, part of the reason for that, I think, is having an opt-out option is generally a good design choice, because if you've built your coin to do something, but for some reason there's somebody on there who doesn't want to mix their coins, because let's say, for instance, you have very clean coins and you don't want to mix it for some reason, I don't really know why you would, but having that option just provides more flexibility. Furthermore, there can be people participating on the network, like verifiers and things like that, who don't necessarily need their coins to be mixed because they're not publishing transactions, and so perhaps that's another way to interpret that line. Cool. Any other questions? That was good. Okay, let's go on. Has anybody heard of Manero? Yay, cool. Okay, so Manero is a fork of CryptoNote, and the main idea behind Manero is it provides this untraceability and unlinkability of transactions. Do people know what a ring signature is? Yes? Ring signature? Okay, so we'll go over that. Okay, so the main idea behind Manero is you have an anonymity parameter, and you can set it to the cheapest by default, and then if you're really trying to hide some incriminating stuff, or you just really care about your privacy, you can tune up the anonymity parameter. So Manero is a privacy-focused altcoin, very much so, and they're built on the CryptoNote protocol, and it essentially creates a set of outputs of which one is yours, and it doesn't reveal which one is yours. And we'll go into why they can do that with the ring signatures, but the main idea is essentially they hide this input-output mapping. And you can prove that your funds came out of one of a set of outputs without revealing which output it is, and in this way we have unlinkability of transactions. So untraceability, well, the definitions are all up there, but untraceability is just the idea that we have a uniform distribution of which possible sender it could have been, which of the end it could have been, and then unlinkable because we don't know which of the outputs came from which of the inputs. Do those sort of basic concepts make sense? We'll talk a little bit more about this. Okay, so this idea of ring signatures. So the main distinction with ring signatures is instead of, okay, so with an ordinary digital signature, the signer needs a single secret key, but a verifier cannot establish the exact identity of the signer. Therefore, so when you encounter a ring signature with the public keys of Alice, Bob, Carol, and Dave, or Alice, Bob, and Carol, you can claim that one of these individuals was the signer, but you don't know which one of them it was. And so we can hide where the transaction is coming from, but then we also need to hide where the transaction is going to. But first, does this make sense? We can hide where the transaction came from precisely because it's coming from the public keys of 3 different people. Temperature check. Yes? Makes sense. Solid. Okay. So we have the automatic creation in Manero. We have the automatic creation of one-time keys derived from a single public key for each peer-to-peer transaction. And so anytime you make a transaction, it'll generate an address, and then it'll send it to Bob's address after. But you only get to see the one-time address, and this is how we make sure that we hide where the transaction is going to as well. Does this make sense? Okay, I'm seeing nods. That's good. Cool. Manero is hard, guys. Okay, so Pros and cons. Oh yeah, that's it.
It doesn't make sense.
Okay. Okay. Does anybody want to take a stab at explaining what they feel like this is saying? Go for it.
So first, we include 3 different public keys in the transaction, and we can sign it only using one of the keys of private keys. So Bob is making the transaction, but additionally the network includes Alice's and Carol's public keys in the transaction. Bob signs the transaction, everything's great, so no one knows who it came from. Then so that we cannot see where it's going to, the network generates a one-time address, which is just a pair of public and private keys, and it sends the transaction to that one-time address, as far as I understand.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
What is this one?
Yeah. So it'll just generate an address, so that it's not sending it directly to Bob's address. So it'll send it to this one-time address, and then the one-time address will then send it to Bob, or you have some series of intermediate steps so that it's not super obvious that one of these people sent a transaction to Bob. Does that make sense?
I mean, I'm just making the assumption that you can trace back, like Bob, from the one-time address.
So the point is that it's difficult to differentiate Bob's address from a series of one-time addresses. Because Bob's address is also like, his address will also change. Okay, we can talk further about this. Okay, solid. All right, so if we keep going, so Monero's pros and cons. No other coin has proven the anonymity behind their product. Zcash comes close. Monero, however, people seem to have a lot of confidence in because they implement ring signatures, which cryptographically are proven to be quite useful. And so because they're based in cryptography, we have a little bit more confidence. And another pro is that a new block is released every minute because with this extra, because they have these extra like obfuscation layers, they don't need to worry as much about security. And so they can publish transactions a little bit faster. So Manero doesn't hide transaction values just yet. An adversary could potentially trace transactions by following, if I know it's likely that Alice sent something to Bob, well then if I just keep taking a look at, well I know Alice sends transactions to Bob every day at like 4 p.m. for instance, because she buys a pizza every day at 4 p.m. Well then I can sort of like go back and do some sort of traffic analysis and try and understand, okay, so this set of people always sends a transaction, like the ring signature that comes out of this set always sends a transaction at 4 p.m. to this other series of addresses. Well, then I can like narrow down the likelihood of this address being Alice's and this address being Bob's. Does that make sense? Still being able to perform traffic analysis. There is still some problems with this. Okay. So now we'll talk a little bit about Zcash. So we did talk about ZK snarks. Who here remembers what a ZK snark is? No problem. Okay. So a ZK snark is a zero-knowledge, succinct, non-interactive arguments of knowledge. So people like to term it crypto magic, but I'm going to use the metaphor of a colorblind man. So imagine that I'm colorblind, and I want somebody to prove to me that whether they're colorblind too. And so if I have 2 pens in my hands, and one of the pens is red and one of them is blue, well, I don't know which one is red and which one is blue, but I know they're like a little bit different, right? So I'm going to put them behind my back. I'm going to show them to the person first, and then I'm going to put them behind my back, and I'll either switch which hand is holding which, or I won't. And then I'll bring it back, and I'll ask the person, so did I switch it or not? And if I do that enough times, well, with some probabilistic, if I do that enough times, like probabilistically, if this person is colorblind, well, they're going to get it 50-50. But if they're not colorblind, well, they should with a much higher probabilistic, with much higher probability, they should be getting it right, whether or not I switched. Does that make sense? So with this idea of having zero knowledge about whether or not they're actually colorblind, but I can still get some sort of information from them, and they can still prove something to me probabilistically, that's the idea behind a ZK snark. So to transfer that to altcoins, the idea is to have an altcoin where the transactions reveal nothing about the input-output addresses and the input-output values. So the base coin is identical to Bitcoin, actually. You mint this base coin to create a black box-like coin, and then in total anonymity, you want to make transactions. And you don't want a way to correlate or distinguish coins and values. And if you want to redeem it back into base coin, you just redeem the base coin. And so Zcash was that heavily based in Bitcoin precisely so that they could use a lot of the implementations of Bitcoin, and they could draw from the user base of Bitcoin. Like, people understand Bitcoin, so they made it similar to that. And so essentially the idea behind this is we want a system that supports fully anonymous payments, and we do this probabilistically. Does that takeaway make sense to everybody? Okay. So if we talk a little bit more about how exactly this works. So the way Bitcoin validates transactions is it proves that the coins could not have been spent previously, and we just check that against the ledger, and it requires no effort by the sender. And then the sender has to prove ownership of the coins that he wants to transfer, because he will digitally sign the transaction by using his secret key. And then for that signature to be verified, the sending address must be disclosed. So the recipient will only be able to spend the coins if his address matches the public address that was saved into the transaction. So that should just be like a quick review of how things work in Bitcoin and how we verify transactions inputs and outputs. And that's trivial because the transferred amount is disclosed. But now understand the problem statement. In Zcash, we're trying to get rid of the inputs and we're trying to obfuscate the inputs and outputs. And so it becomes much more difficult to, how do you verify the amount being transferred? So Zcash uses this zero-knowledge proof, specifically zk-SNARKs, to prove those same three facts without revealing any information about the sender, recipient, or the assets that are being transferred. And so every valid transaction is going to have its own zk-SNARK proof that proves exactly that the input assets have not been spent previously, that the creator of the transaction has the authority to spend those input assets, and then the quantity and the type of assets equals the quantity of the inputs equals what's coming out on the other side. So it just uses those zk-SNARKs to prove exactly the properties that we need. Okay, but as you might imagine, going through this proof is like really computationally expensive, and it's pretty complicated. So Zcash is doing this, and they've built an entire coin off of that. But people have also postulated using zk-SNARKs and setting this up in Ethereum, for instance. And the way people have postulated doing that is having that verification algorithm having the verification algorithm's building blocks pushed as a precompiled contract onto the blockchain. And then the generator would be run off-chain to produce a proving key and a verification key. And then any prover would use a proving key to create a proof off-chain. So a lot of it happens off-chain, and they would just interact with things on the blockchain. But part of the reason that nobody has done that on Ethereum yet is because it's so complicated. But yeah, so the main takeaway, again, is that we are able to perform the same three things that we need to validate a transaction in Bitcoin using this zk-SNARK proof. Questions? Is everyone so confused that they don't know what to ask? Okay, is there any part of this that I can repeat that would be more helpful? Okay, I'm gonna leave this to discussion then. All right, okay. So if we keep going, Zcash is, as we've said, an implementation of the zero-knowledge security layer, and it's just a layer on top of the Bitcoin protocol, Bitcoin code base, to enable transparent transactions that actually obfuscate just the inputs and the values and the outputs. And so just by obfuscating those certain bits of information, they have to add all of this complexity because of this need for verification of our transactions. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Cool, all right. Who here knows what homomorphic encryption is? Okay, this is part of how the Zcash. So we treat ZK Scenario sort of as like a black box, and this is part of how Zcash uses the idea of ZK snarks, and this is sort of the math behind it. If you're interested, we're going to post the slides, but I don't want to spend too much time on this. Okay. But yeah, so the pros of Zcash are that it's fully anonymous, precisely because we're hiding so much information, and it can be integrated with any consensus mechanism. So if you remember what exactly ZK snarks are, it's just a way to prove some information without having the total picture. And so probabilistically, we can generate a proof that, well, we're pretty sure something is true. And for that reason, it's just like a sub-protocol that we can just plug in to whatever like case we want. ZK snarks aren't just, they don't just exist within the blockchain space, it's just a cryptographic like protocol. And so for that reason, it can be integrated with any consensus mechanism. And then so some cons that we to talk about is that it's very computationally expensive to generate this. So you have to have like a really good reason to be, to like not want to share that information. So the ZK snark proof system like requires a lot of, like 40 seconds of computation on a modern CPU is a lot for just one transaction. So you might imagine like there are some problems with that, and that's part of the reason why Ethereum is perhaps not the most ideal platform, because Ethereum like requires your Ether as gas, and I don't know how much gas you want to be spending on computation to send just a really secure transaction. Okay, and then it also requires a semi-trusted one-time setup. So at the very beginning, you do need to set up this black box so that it can generate this generator algorithm, a verifier algorithm, and a prover algorithm so that people can interact with this protocol. And you sort of have to have like a trusted setup of that. Okay, does this make sense? Yeah, go for it.
I'm not sure if this is like the right question, but
go for it.
you're saying it integrates with any consensus mechanism.
Yeah.
Does it matter if, I guess it's not the consensus mechanism, but UTXO versus base, does it not matter on the structure of that?
So I don't think it should matter, just because the way we verify transactions the way we verify transactions in Bitcoin differs a little bit than we do in Ethereum, but it still consists of going back through the ledger and like trying to figure out whether or not this person actually has the inputs. And for that reason, it should be abstractable, be able to be abstracted to ZK snarks. Yeah.
Can you say why ZK snarks are so resource intensive?
So resource intensive?
Why is that?
Yeah, so if you think back to the example I gave of like the colorblind man, well, the only way I can really know whether or not this person's lying to me and increase the probability that they're not lying to me is if I do lots and lots of trials, right? And that's computationally expensive. Cool. Any other questions? Those were good. No. Okay, solid. Let's keep going. So, some conclusions. So this is how we measure, just like a rough comparison of how we measure levels of anonymity. Because if you remember, Brian has precisely told us that, well, it's not just black and white, it's really more of a scale. And so if we have Bitcoin at the top, that's the least anonymous. Well, at the very bottom there we have Zcash, because it uses these sort of like ZK snarks that allow us to obfuscate just about everything that we didn't know we could. And so yeah, if you are interested in more information, I would read up on the Lightning Network and onion routing and confidential transactions. Lightning Network might be most interesting out of all three of those, precisely because they recently came out with a new update. If you guys have been following the space, should be really exciting for scalability especially. Okay, so that's all we have for you today. If you have any, yeah, never mind, Brian has more. So, oh, wait, no, yeah, we totally have another section. I'm so sorry.
Or yeah. I guess so. Like how you would actually mix coins today, the most feasible option is you just shapeshift everything through altcoin exchanges, and then you do some sort of Tor and VPN to make sure that your internet access isn't traceable, and so you do some sort of like put in a lot of effort to mix coins, but we'll get into Mimblewimble. So has anybody heard of Mimblewimble? Has anybody, so this is actually, it comes from Harry Potter. So has anybody heard of or read the Harry Potter books? Okay, so Actually, I didn't read the book, so I don't know. Okay. So Mimblewimble, if you've never heard of it, in the Harry Potter books, in the Harry Potter universe, it's a spell that binds the target's tongue so that they're restricted from talking about a certain subject. So a little bit of backstory about Mimblewimble is it originated in the Bitcoin Wizards IRC channel. So it's just a bunch of people who are talking about maybe protocol research or just random Bitcoin stuff. And so on August 1st in 2016, some random user by the name of Major Player, he says, "Hi, I have this idea for improving privacy in Bitcoin. My friend who knows technology says this channel would have interest." And he drops this onion link. So if anybody knows what a .onion link does, it's a website that only exists on the Tor protocol. You can only access it if you're using Tor. And he just drops this onion link with this plain text file. So some people actually looked at it. They realized that it wasn't a malicious file or anything. It was just a plain text file. So they downloaded it and took a look. And so it's written by a pseudonymous author, Tom Elvis Judicior. So this is Lord Voldemort's real name in the French editions of the Harry Potter novels. But this kind of resembles back into Satoshi Nakamoto. It's a pseudonym. You don't know who this person is. And yeah, it's just a mystery left for everyone. But the idea is that this guy dropped this link, just left, and then the people who did check it out realized, whoa, this is actually a pretty interesting protocol. So what is Mimblewimble? So what is the proposal that Mimblewimble came up with? So it's actually a design for a blockchain-based ledger. So it can be, it doesn't have to be a fork to Bitcoin. It could be just a side channel or a side chain or an altcoin. But it was designed mainly to make a cryptographic protocol to make Bitcoin more scalable and private. So the idea was, and it's an alternate blockchain that supports a different type of transaction than what Bitcoin uses currently. So it inherently changes the structure and the model of what a transaction looks like. So inherently, it can't be or if you wanted to implement it on top of Bitcoin, it'd be a hard fork. But the downside is that because this protocol changes a lot of the aspects of what a transaction is and how it is implemented, it doesn't actually support Bitcoin script. It doesn't support a lot of other stuff. That's why it's meant as a sidechain and altcoin, where you can, if you need to use it, you can send your Bitcoin to this sidechain. It'll do whatever you need to do with its limited functionality, which is still it's highly scalable and high privacy. And then if you ever need to get it back, you just send it back into the Bitcoin network. That's what it's meant for. It's just so that you can make sure that your Bitcoin is more privacy centered and not as open to what I mentioned in the very first half of the lecture. So the Mimblewimble proposal actually proposed two different changes. They actually proposed to help improve privacy, but also proposed to help improve the scalability aspect. So what Mimblewimble does, it supports what's called confidential transactions, where all values inside your transaction are encrypted. They're just ciphertext to everyone else who's just looking at it. They're blinded with these blinding factors. So anybody who looks at a transaction has no idea who sent it, how much was sent in this transaction, and anything whatsoever. And it uses really fancy math to generate dummy outputs so that receivers can be sure that they're spending valid UTXOs. And the way that they also make sure that a transaction is valid is they make sure to sum up the inputs. The whole idea is that you have a sum of the inputs and the sum of the outputs, and if you were to actually add them together, they should equal 0, because how much money you put into a transaction and how much you get out should always equal 0, or else something's wrong with your math there. So all you have to verify is that the sum is essentially 0, and you can be sure that this transaction is pretty valid, but you don't see anything that's going on within this transaction. And then the second proposal in the privacy aspect is that it bundles many transactions together so that kind of like in Manero, where you have multiple signatures in a transaction, so you can't tell who it came from. The idea here is it bundles a lot of other transactions into one large transaction. So all you get essentially when you see it out in public, you see a list of input, or like you see a list of input addresses maybe or outputs, but you can't determine where they're going and where they came from. So that's the idea of the first. You have confidential transactions where anyone can't just look inside a transaction, and two, it obfuscates the trail of a transaction by making sure that anybody who's sending money into Mimblewimble and sending money in a Mimblewimble transaction, their whole money trail is kind of mixed up or scrambled. And so the next thing that they propose to do is to improve scalability. So what it actually does, it changes a lot about what a Bitcoin transaction looks like. So it simplifies it a lot by accounting for, it's basically assuming the fact that most Bitcoin transactions are just not pay to script hash, but pay to public key hash, meaning that you're just sending Bitcoin from one address to another. And so they're taking that into account and saying that most people just send Bitcoin from one person to another. So we don't really need too much of this Bitcoin script functionality. We're just going to make it so that these transactions that happen in Mimblewimble are as simple as possible. It changes the verification process. So you don't even have to look at previous transactions. You can generate certain aspects from your Mimblewimble transaction, and you can verify your transaction through there. And what this is good for is it reduces your need to actually download your entire blockchain history ever since the Genesis block. If someone from the early ages of Bitcoin were to send his Bitcoin that he never touched for 10 years or something, or no, not 10 years, but 9 years or something, they can be sure that if the only people that could verify that transaction dating all the way back then would be someone who has the entire blockchain downloaded, and that's a lot of memory, or that's a lot of storage space that most people don't want to deal with. So this Mimblewimble scalability proposal reduces the fact that you don't need to download the entire blockchain history to actually verify transactions, no matter where they came from. So that's a little bit about Mimblewimble. I can't dive into too much of the technical details because personally, I know only a little. I don't know too much about the technical side of things. But if you want to learn more, there's a lot of articles online, and I think I'll post a few readings for you guys to check out Mimblewimble. But I think it's a really reminiscent aspect of what, it really reminisces back when Bitcoin started out, when Satoshi Nakamoto posted his white paper. This was just posted, randomly dropped in an IRC chat, and no one knows who wrote it. Okay, yeah. So it's actually really math heavy. So it was a proposal at first. People are actually working on it. What's actually really cool is that a few weeks after the first paper was dropped, some person by the name of Igneous Parvis or something like that, he went into the IRC channel and posted a link to a GitHub link saying, I'm working on an implementation for Mimblewimble. And so the cool aspect is they're using Harry Potter references. That's the dude that invented the invisibility cloak. They're using this really, I guess, quirky aspect of Harry Potter to I guess interact in the Bitcoin space. But currently, because Mimblewimble changes a lot of aspects about what Bitcoin transactions look like, it's there's been implementations that have been worked on or that are being currently in development, but it can't be applied to Bitcoin just yet because of the fact that it's so drastically different. But it's an interesting idea that hopefully you can see being used later on. So to answer your question, it's not done yet. It's being worked on by the team at Blockstream or something like that. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, here.
So it's a scientific, does that mean that you have
So the idea of a sidechain is that it's like a separate blockchain on its own that you can send Bitcoin to, and they'll whatever you need to do in the Mimblewimble sidechain, like you can interact with it. Like the Mimblewimble like blockchain, it has very limited functionality. It only like makes it so that you can only send transactions to and to someone and back or receive. And because it's assuming that you have like you're not doing too complicated of things in the Mimblewimble chain, that's how you get like this sort of privacy and the scalability aspect. But it's saying that sure, you use Mimblewimble for most of your activity. If you ever need to use some sort of complicated kind of transaction that you might only get from Bitcoin, yeah, transfer it into Bitcoin, do whatever you need to do, transfer back. So it's just like a side blockchain that you would do most of your business on to stay anonymous or private, and then once you need to do anything more complicated, you transfer it back and forth. Any other questions? So that's the last slide. Yeah, so that's Mimblewimble. I think it's pretty interesting. That's all for today. We'll post homework and readings later. But actually not homework, but we'll release the final paper prompt so that you can get started. Yeah. So this final paper is like a good chunk of your decal grade, I guess. So it's pretty necessary to do. So yeah, get started. It doesn't have to be too complicated, but the prompts will be something like find a blockchain online and analyze it however you want. So yeah, thank you. And we don't have class next week. We have class the following week.
Oh, I'm just filling out a survey.